Ever since its release in 2011, Dark Souls has become the classic that has played a big part in bringing the Souls-like genre of video games into the mainstream, with their previous game Demon's Souls being the one that essentially started the genre. Over the years, Dark Souls has had a major impact on the world of video games. It's seen a lot of success, and many people have tried to replicate the style of the Souls series. Some of them have been pretty good, others, meh. So far, nobody else seems to be able to capture that exact magic From Software is able to put into their games. If you don't know, Dark Souls is an action role-playing game that is notorious for its difficulty. It takes place in the dark fantasy land of Lordran, where the player has to battle their way through unrelenting forces. The mostly consistent balance between difficulty and fairness made the game perfect for those that love a good challenge. Now, I love the Souls series for the same reasons that I'm sure most people love it. The really cool looking and difficult enemies and bosses that are satisfying to beat, the really intricate and well-designed levels that reward you for exploring every little nook and cranny, and the incredibly addicting gameplay loop of making some progress before dying over and over and over. But something else that I really love about From Software's games is its storytelling. Now, before I get to the story, I should first discuss the gameplay, as the two are pretty connected. When you start up the game and get past the character creation screen and opening cutscene, you're dropped into the world. You wake up in a prison cell as a gross undead form of your character, and you're set free from your cell to figure out where to go. Beyond a pretty quick tutorial that you can just breeze past if you want, the game doesn't really tell you much of anything. It's up to you to make your way through the prison and figure out how to deal with the first boss and where to go next. And that's how it is for pretty much the whole game. You have to find your way through the areas, you have to figure out the best way to beat or get past enemies, and you have to beat the crazy bosses. Unless you decide to summon some help for the bosses, then it isn't really all up to you, but the rest of the game pretty much is. There isn't a map for you to use to figure out where you are, and there aren't any mission trackers that show exactly where to go. It's up to you to figure out almost everything, and that goes for the story too.
But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain.
Cutscenes are the method that a lot of game developers use to tell a good chunk of their stories in games. With the desire to make it more cinematic, there are many games that are presented almost as interactive movies. Some pretty much are movies. And while I don't mind this approach, I do wonder why cutscenes are sometimes used so much. Video games have one thing that no other medium really has: interactivity. So I love it when a game leans even more into that unique element when telling its story, because it'll typically make for a more engaging experience. Dark Souls is one of those games that takes advantage of its medium and makes the player experience its story in a way that could only really work best in a video game. If you don't go out of your way to figure out the story, then you'll probably be a little lost as to what exactly is going on and why. Unlike a lot of modern single-player games, Dark Souls' story is provided a little differently. The game has a pretty minimal approach when it comes to things like cutscenes, so you'll see one every so often, but besides the opening cutscene that plays when you start the game, they don't really tell you much of what's going on. With the game primarily focused on the fighting and exploring side of things, I never found it a huge problem not knowing what the hell was going on when I first played. And I get that a lot of people need to have the context of what's happening to really get invested and care about what they're doing, but I used to just see it as something along the lines of an older Mario or Zelda game. I mean, in the first Legend of Zelda, you're quickly told the game's premise through a tiny bit of reading, and then you're thrown into the world with the freedom to pretty much go wherever you want. It doesn't concern itself with much of a story, and instead wants to impart a sense of wonder and freedom to the player as you're left to figure out where to go with very little guidance. For me, the story of Dark Souls was simply the experience of going through the intricately designed levels and trying to beat the insane bosses. For a little bit, I honestly didn't think Dark Souls had much of an actual narrative beyond what was discussed in the opening, ringing a couple bells and killing everyone and everything that gets in your way. But once I discovered there were actually lore videos on YouTube that explained everything that was going on, oh boy, I realized just how rich of a story that Dark Souls has. And it's not even just the lore, but the side quests also help to enrich the experience of the game. When it comes to the lore, there are a couple of methods the game uses to convey it to the players. Outside of gathering information from talking to the NPCs in the game, the main way that the lore can be figured out is through item descriptions. From Software took the common element in video games of having descriptions for the items you pick up and incorporated little tidbits of lore into them. So as you're picking up more items throughout the game, you can learn more about the lore of the world too. This method of storytelling ends up becoming something like a puzzle. They split up the story into a bunch of little pieces, and it's up to the player to collect those pieces and figure out how it all fits together. It's not only done to have you interact with the game more in order to learn the story, but it also further incentivizes exploring so you can try to get as many items as possible to figure out as much of the story as you can. While most of the game's story is told through the lore of the world and its characters, there are a handful of side quests and little storylines that are in Dark Souls as well. In a more traditional RPG, side quests will consist of talking to an NPC, being told to do something for them, doing that thing, and then returning for a reward. Completing the task given to you is where the challenge would typically come from. Whether it's finding a specific item or defeating a particular enemy, the majority of side quests tend to follow this kind of structure. In Dark Souls, however, side quests mostly consist of just talking to NPCs. Sometimes you'll have to do a little more, like killing a group of enemies, but usually all you have to do is talk to the NPC. Now the tricky part usually comes from trying to find these guys. As you make your way through each level, there are a handful of recurring characters that you're able to interact with. You can encounter these characters multiple times throughout the game, and each time you talk to them in a new location, you'll learn more about them and the journeys that they're on. But because there is no map and there are no trackers of any kind in the game, these seemingly simple side quests can get a little challenging. And there are many incredibly obscure elements involved in finding some of these characters that would require pretty extensive exploring and experimenting in order to find them. I imagine most people tend to look up guides for some of these side quests, or even just watch other people do them entirely on YouTube instead. While getting stuck or lost trying to do a side quest can be pretty frustrating, I do think it makes it that much more satisfying if you do eventually figure out what you were missing. Similar to the satisfaction you might feel from beating a tough boss, there's also a bit of gratification from finishing a side quest or learning a new part of the story. There are a lot of great storylines in Dark Souls, but one of my favorites is the story of the knight Artorias and his wolf pal Sif. Without delving too far into it so as to avoid spoiling anything to those who don't know, you can encounter Sif as a boss midway through the game, and it'll be just like any other boss. You fight it, maybe die a couple times, beat it, and move on to the next part of the game. However, if you get through the Artorias fight and the rest of that part of the game, you'll find that the encounter with Sif gets completely recontextualized. And on top of that, if you instead wait to fight Sif until after you've gotten through Artorias and that whole section of the game, then you'll find that a different cutscene will actually play when you get to Sif. And, well, I'll just let you learn the rest for yourself. Or, if you don't want to go through the trouble, there is at least one good video on YouTube that I can think of that tells this story very well. The point is, there are a lot of stories like Artorias and Sif's that can be so easily missed, but if you explore and can piece it together, you'll be rewarded with some incredible storytelling. Dark Souls, and other Souls games for that matter, are all fun enough to play without learning about the story. But going that extra mile to discover what it has to offer can be a satisfying experience in its own right. And with the gameplay being so intertwined with how you experience the story, I don't think this could have been done in anything but a video game. By prioritizing gameplay, From Software was able to craft a narrative that requires players to explore the world, to piece everything together like a puzzle, greatly utilizing the element of interactivity that makes video games so unique.